A case can be made for Full Metal Daemon Muramasa being the greatest visual novel ever created. Released by Nitro Plus in 2009 and localized in 2021, if you have not read this visual novel, I strongly urge you to do so. To put it simply, it's a masterpiece, and I'm going to do my best to talk about everything that makes it so phenomenal. Every single character is memorable, there's interesting political intrigue, and the world building is exceptional. The story is tightly written, clever, and really gets at your emotions, so I strongly recommend you read it. But do be warned, this story is uncompromisingly dark and disturbing. I would rate it as being as dark, if not darker, than works like Berserk or Saya no Uta. Now I'll get into the in-depth analysis of the many components that make this visual novel a masterpiece. Massive spoilers ahead. First, the world and the setting. The setting is incredibly interesting. We basically have an alternate history with the time period set roughly the same as World War II. But the story does a good job of making you understand why history has diverged from what it is in our time, and it's because of the world's unique lore, the Tsurugi. For example, it's explained that America tried fighting Britain for its independence and lost multiple times, and the reason is because you can't forge Tsurugi in the New World, and this is just a very clever and compelling way of world building. In this world, Britain has conquered most of the planet and ended up becoming somewhat similar to the Third Reich. We aren't given specific details on the working of Britain's government, but it's said that they rule their territories with an iron fist and they have racial supremacist tendencies. It's also mentioned that the Soviet regime, which is Britain's main enemy in this world, is also very brutal. So every single organized government group is portrayed as being some combination of corrupt, tyrannical, imperialistic. None of them are groups that you want to root for. The Rokuhara Shogunate is a fascinating antagonist group. First, we learn that they cowardly turned on their nation during the war so that they could grab power, and now they rule as tyrants, imposing an authoritarian rule where citizens are oppressed and struggle to access basic provisions like medicine. We also learn much later in that the shogun is planning to essentially plunge Yamato right back into a war very soon, and he doesn't give a damn if it ends up killing the entire country. I'm going to go into greater depth on the specific characters making up Rokuhara later because they're just really intriguing. And next I want to talk about the action and the fight scenes. While some people complain about them, saying that they are too long and perhaps go into too much detail, I actually really adore how this novel handles its fight scenes. This isn't a system like Fate where you just make up the rules using magic or whatever. They explain the mechanics behind Tsurugi combat at the beginning, and if you pay attention, you are going to see that nearly all of the fights, whether they're sword duels or Tsurugi, the author gives a real, grounded explanation of what's going on in the fight. And a large part of this is likely due to the writer being an expert in Kenjutsu himself. Some people say that the fights are too long, but I think that they're usually just about the right length. When you're writing a fight scene, you're trying to strike a balance, because if you don't spend enough time explaining what's happening, it's lame and forgettable. But if you spend too much time, the reader gets tired and loses interest. And personally, I felt that this balance was struck pretty well. I will say that not all of the fights are perfect. The two main nitpicks I have are that sometimes the fights will play out in a way that they start off using real tactics that are grounded in reality, and then at the end of it, Kageaki just wins by using his railgun. And also there are times when it's described how Kageaki is utterly exhausted and basically half dead, and yet he just gets back up and continues fighting for like another 15 minutes. And this kind of thing is acceptable once, but it really does happen more than one time. But mainly I'm nitpicking, I really enjoyed all the fights. But for me, what really elevates Muramasa to perfection is the richness and depth of its themes. From some of the discussion I've seen online, it seems like some people don't really understand the themes, despite the game beating you over the head with them the entire way through. But anyway, I'm going to go over my interpretation of the game's themes and messages and why I think they're so brilliant. At its core, Muramasa is challenging the traditional hero versus villain, good versus evil worldview. This is the worldview that I argue most people in life hold. This guy is the hero, that guy is the villain. This group here are the good guys, and that group there are the bad guys. And there are multiple ways that it challenges this, but the primary way it demonstrates this is through the law of balance, which basically serves as the driving plot mechanism, the main source of conflict, and also a physical manifestation of this statement about morality that the author is trying to drive home. The author is saying that when you're a part of a conflict and you kill someone, it doesn't matter what side you're on. You might be tempted to think that you're the good guy, that you had no choice, and you might even justify the killing and call yourself a hero, and history shows us that this is what people do almost all the time. But when you do this, you're deluded, and you're falling victim to the hubris and self-righteousness that has plagued mankind for all of human history. You are not a hero when you kill your enemy. There is always a cost, and the law of balance is there to make sure you never forget it. If you subscribe to a black and white worldview where you and your faction are the heroes, and you just have to defeat the bad people and then you save the day, you're severely lacking in self-awareness. That's not to say that you should never take up arms or fight for a cause, but you need to be aware of what you're doing. This is not a story of heroes. I think if you've read Muramasa, you'll agree with me when I say that Kageaki is one of the greatest protagonists of all time, and the heart and soul of this visual novel. I have not felt so much emotion for a fictional character like I have for Kageaki probably since Guts. He is an incredibly interesting character from the moment he shows up. At first, he is sort of an enigma. It's hard to pin down exactly what his motives are, and it's completely shocking when he kills Yuhi. But the more you follow him, the more you feel sympathetic towards him. This is a man who has truly suffered. He's put in a terrible position, and yet he's still trying to do what I think most people would agree is the right thing. When Soramachi fights Kageaki, he challenges him saying, "What are you doing? You can just stop this at any time. Just walk away." Kageaki is fighting against impossible odds and choosing the path that's going to make him suffer more because he blames himself for Ginseigo and he believes this path is going to lead to the least death. I want to take the time to go on a quick tangent and say that Soramachi is a brilliant antagonist. He is essentially the perfect contrast to Kageaki, because while Kageaki is burdened by his morality, Soramachi has no morality to speak of. He gives no shits, he does whatever pleases him or whatever helps him get ahead, and I would argue that he's one of the characters that suffers the least in this visual novel. He's really the Joker to Kageaki's Batman. But anyways, back to Kageaki, he is someone you want to root for. He is an incredibly tragic character in a game that is filled to the brim with tragic characters. The world would be a much better place if we were all like Kageaki. But for all his merits, Kageaki is forced to contend with the law of balance. If I was just going to say that he was a hero going on a righteous journey to save the world, I would be missing the entire point of Muramasa. Whenever he has to kill to achieve his ends, he is forced to pay the price for the law of balance. It isn't until much later in the visual novel that we learn more about the origin of the law of balance. We learn that Muramasa and Ginseigo were physically created about 500 years ago after Grandpa Muramasa came to a profound philosophical realization after many years of contemplation. He created a tsurugi with the intention of eliminating conflict. Despite being well-intentioned and philosophically sound, this ended up leading to much more death and destruction. The reason for this is because most men simply cannot handle the effects of the law of balance. It will drive them mad, and that influences the soldiers around them, and so it ends in catastrophe. At its core, this is a story about Kageaki coming to terms with the law of balance. It may seem like Kageaki is fighting the world, and in a literal sense that may be correct, but the real conflict is that he's fighting himself. He is a tortured man who is absolutely heartbroken whenever he has to kill one of his allies. But at the end of a novel, he doesn't just come to accept the law of balance, he fully embraces it. By leading his mercenary group, he is literally bringing the law of balance to the entire world. It's quite a development if you think about it. While he spends so much of a novel trying not to kill anyone so as to not evoke the law of balance, by the end he will literally kill anyone on the planet for any reason so as to show people the law of balance. I haven't read the epilogue of Muramasa as it has not been translated, but I'd like to believe that in the long term, Kageaki's actions saved the world, because what I hope happened is that as more and more people fell victim to the law of balance, more and more people would realize that they shouldn't kill their enemies, and a more peaceful society emerges. So anyways, that's what I think the grand overarching message of Muramasa is, and now I want to go in depth about all the other routes. I really enjoyed the Nemesis route, although it had the least impact on me emotionally, and I would rate it as the weakest route overall, not to mention the incessant, annoying decision trees. But it was really interesting to see a revenge story where the character actively wants the person seeking revenge against them to carry it out. To Kageaki, having Kanai righteously kill him is the greatest fate imaginable. If Muramasa were a more generic revenge story, it might be about Kageaki trying to convince Kanai that he wasn't actually in the wrong, to see things from his perspective, and realize that revenge is ultimately not the way. But of course, Muramasa is much different from that. Kageaki has no excuses to give. He wholeheartedly supports her when she wants to exact justice for Yuhi. He doesn't just want to be punished, he needs it. He wants to die, but he doesn't want to do it himself, as that would be the easy way out. So in a twisted way, he views Kanai as his savior. And I also enjoyed seeing the psychology of the GHQ lieutenant. Basically, she has always been a twisted psychopath who takes pleasure in killing. But the conflict within her is that despite her need to kill, she still doesn't want to kill indiscriminately, so she becomes obsessed with killing justifiably, such as killing for vengeance. Overall, the Nemesis route was really enjoyable, even if I wouldn't give it a 10 out of 10. Now the hero route, on the other hand, is something that I would rate as a 10 out of 10. Ayane Ichijo is an incredibly compelling character. She is the living personification of the ideal of justice. If she sees evil and tyranny, she must fight it, no matter the cost. This type of worldview is something that I can respect, even if I disagree with it. During their debate, at the end of the route, I believe that Kageaki is correct when he denounces the idea of a hero. He does not tell her that it's wrong to take up arms for a cause, but due to his own experiences, he knows full well that it is delusional to call oneself a hero. Ayane responds to Kageaki's arguments by essentially saying, "I don't care, I'm going to pursue justice anyways, no matter the cost." Towards the end of the route, there is a scene that is incredibly graphic and one of the most disturbing scenes in the entire novel, and while I can't go into specifics, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. It is a scene where Ichijo is forcibly confronted with the reality of her ideals. She is faced with the fact that her ideals will forever be contradictory, and that some people or things can simultaneously be both good and evil. And how does she respond? She accepts it, and she keeps moving forward, pursuing her ideals. And the ending / aftermath of the hero route is very well done. It ends with Ayane being left with Muramasa. Thus, if Ayane wants to continue fighting, she needs to obey the law of balance, and she does. She fully embraces and accepts it, and continues on in pursuit of her ideals. Ayane Ichijo is without a doubt one of the greatest heroines of all time. Chachamaru is yet another brilliant character in this visual novel, and although I am very regretful that she did not get a full route to herself, what we do get of her is still very fantastic. On top of having a very likable and entertaining personality that really steals the show whenever she's on screen, she is strong, cunning, and ruthless. But it's not until very late in the story that we understand why it is that she does what she does. She is also an example of a tragic character who has been tortured her whole life, although in her case, she really didn't do anything wrong, at least to begin with. You can make a case for Kageaki ultimately being the cause of Genseigo and his own suffering, but Chachamaru did not deserve her suffering. It was the unfortunate conditions of her birth and the horrible treatment from people around her that drove her to do what she did. When she met Hikaru, she was in a state of despair, which is quite understandable since her life circumstances had been completely dreadful. But then Hikaru tells her that she ought to just try fighting the world, because why not? It's better than hopelessness and despair. So in my own opinion, Chachamaru's lashing out and plotting to destroy the world is sort of the natural reaction to a world that has given her nothing but suffering. Hikaru is one of the most complicated characters in the entire story. It is very hard to say for certain what she's thinking a lot of the time, because she does say some very different things in different routes, but we at least know a few of her motivations. She has a very deep love for her brother, and she is very, very angry at having been robbed of a relationship with her father, and that caused her to feel intense abandonment. Towards the end of the game, we learn that when Hikaru is Genseigo, her consciousness is in a dreamlike state. To say that Genseigo is simply insane or cruel is not the best understanding of her character. She does not feel any malice when she kills. It is incredibly unsettling seeing someone commit these atrocities and do it while they appear to be in a state of zen. At some level, Genseigo is a complete rejection of traditional morality. There is no good or evil to Genseigo. There is only might, and Hikaru will simply do things to help impose her will on the world, while not even registering anything regarding right or wrong. She is simply interested in fulfilling her desires. I'd like to use this to segue into who I think is one of the most underrated characters in this novel, Hikaru and Kageaki's mom, Subaru. Her morality can be described as sort of pacifist humanitarian, and in the story she acts as a perfect counterweight to Genseigo. One small detail I noticed is that the only times you see Hikaru get extremely, genuinely angry is when she interacts with her mother. This could be because of how she blames her mom as the reason why she can't be with her father, but it could also be symbolic of how their values are antithetical. Earlier in the story, when Kageaki has to deal with the group of bandits in his village, his mother tells him, "You must do it without killing a single one." She says this because she is aware of the futility of violence, saying that if Kageaki succeeds in killing some of them and driving them off, he isn't really solving the problem, because eventually they or their relatives are going to come back seeking vengeance, and conversely, if Kageaki dies, she will seek vengeance against them. So either way, you lose. And she also plays an instrumental role in the hero route in helping Kageaki realize that Ichijo's heroism wasn't correct. Overall, she is just a wonderful character. And finally, on to Muramasa. If I had to say which girl would be the best pairing for Kageaki, it would without a doubt be Muramasa. And there's a lot of reasons for this. She's been with him this entire journey, and it's really fascinating going from where they're at the beginning, where you can tell that they're sort of trying to work together, but they're still fighting one another, and they don't really trust each other. And by the end of the novel, it's very clear that she by far has the deepest bond with him. I would argue that the happiest we actually see Kageaki is towards the end when he's living together with Muramasa. And she helps him realize some very important things, like coming to terms with his past mistakes and letting him know he doesn't need to live his life feeling so guilty all the time. Whereas the other heroines are characterized by their own ideals that run counter to Kageaki's, Muramasa is the only girl who is truly supporting him. The two are very similar to each other in terms of their goals. Thus, I give Muramasa the award for both Best Arachnid and Best Girl. So now that I've covered all the main characters, I'll quickly spend some time gushing over some of the side characters, who I also believe are incredibly important. First, the GHQ guys, George Garrett and Clive Cannon. They both add a whole lot to the story. I really love the approach to George's character and how this novel tackles the issue of race as a whole. When you're making a character who is prejudiced, it's easy to kind of portray the character as some kind of angry, immature buffoon, but this does not describe George at all. Instead, he is cold-blooded, and we get to see the twisted rationale he uses to justify him having so much confidence in his prejudiced beliefs. It doesn't preach to you, and it's not too on the nose, which is why I really like this novel's approach to such a sensitive topic. Clive is much more likable than George. His actions do a good job of driving a lot of the plot forward. We don't know his motivations right off the bat, but when we eventually learn that he's trying to do all of this for his country, it makes sense and it's good writing. Now let's get into talking about Rokuharu, specifically the generals. I think Raicho is my least favorite because I believe he is a tad underutilized, but Shishku really gets to shine at a few times, specifically as an antagonist in the Nemesis route. But my favorite by far is Yusa Doshin. He is shown to be the most experienced general and one of the smartest characters in the story. There's a scene in the hero route where Kageaki and Ayane are trying to pose as spies, and they meet with him, and he instantly figures out they're spies but doesn't say anything, and he does this without even looking at them. His back is turned. It's insane. And there's also a scene in another route where he casually gives Kageaki really great advice about being a warrior and cultivating focus. And the theater scene, Jesus H. Christ. There is a lot of NTR in this story, and a lot of scenes that are designed to make your gut wrench, but that theater scene might just take the cake. Yeah, this visual novel is going to do its best to make you uncomfortable at times, but the dark scenes always have a point. It's not just dark for the sake of being dark. I also really like the minor villains that appear in the first few chapters. Some of them only show up for a single chapter, but they're still incredibly memorable and well written and serve a purpose. This game is just really good at writing villains and tragic characters. I also want to briefly mention the music. Some of the tracks made me feel nostalgic for them the first time I listened to them, and that's no mean feat. I imagine that when I boot up the OST in another 10 years from now or so, I'm gonna remember it and just start crying. The only nitpick I might add here is that I wish we get more battle themes. But overall, this soundtrack is memorable and has a lot of personality, and a lot of the tracks really fit the time period well. And lastly, the humor. This is actually one of the funniest visual novels I've ever read. I would not expect something like this to be so funny, but it really is. Some of the humor is just completely absurd and unexpected, and a lot of the humor is due to Kageaki just being a really strange guy. So I hope I've done a good job making a case for Full Metal Daemon Muramasa being one of, if not the greatest visual novel ever made. If you liked the video, please leave a like and subscribe. I'd love to know your thoughts and opinions down in the comments.